Welcome to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
The Continent,
and of course, our flagship, Chain Reaction. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This week on Chain Reaction.
It was just over 5 months ago that Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin led a mutiny that saw his fighters occupy the Russian cities of Rostov and Voronezh. 2 months after agreeing to end the mutiny and withdraw his forces to Belarus, Prigozhin was dead, his plane exploding in midair in an assassination attempt almost certainly orchestrated by the Kremlin. Before it mutinied, the Wagner Group had provided critical support to Russian interests and pursued its own goals in Ukraine, Syria, and at least half a dozen African countries. With Prigozhin's death, what will become of his private army, and what does this mean for Russia's ability to project power in places it prefers not to deploy its conventional military forces? To discuss these questions and more, we've assembled a Wagner Group dream team of Colin Clarke, Chris Faulkner, and Raphael Parens. Colin P. Clarke is a senior fellow in the program on national security at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He's also an assistant teaching professor at the Institute for Politics and Strategy at Carnegie Mellon University, where he also has responsibilities with the Institute for Strategic Analysis and serves on the executive board for the Masters of Information Technology Strategy program. Christopher M. Faulkner is an assistant professor of national security affairs in the College of Distance Education at the US Naval War College. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow with the National Security Affairs Department at NWC. Before joining NWC, he served as postdoctoral researcher with the University of Central Florida and as a visiting assistant professor at Centre College. He earned his PhD in security studies from the University of Central Florida and was a Minerva Jennings Randolph Peace and Security Scholar with the U.S. Institute of Peace. Raphael Parens is a Eurasia Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He researches African conflict with a focus on West and Central Africa, Russian military policy, and paramilitary groups. He received his MA in International Security Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and he's currently based in London. It's now been almost 5 months since Yevgeny Prigozhin led Wagner fighters in an insurrection against the Russian government, and 3 months since his apparent death in a plane crash. Chris, what's the Wagner Group up to now?
Yeah, I think it depends on where we look. Many ways across the African theater, it's business as usual. I think that's maybe the best way to describe it. The Central African Republic, it's still alive and well, still engaged in economic exploitation, kind of in the local economy, still engaged in regime security. And Mali, maybe its most recent operations, it assisted the Malian armed forces in taking a Kidal from Tuareg forces in the country's north, kind of a symbolic victory, if you will, for Wagner personnel and the Malian armed forces. And Syria and Libya, there's still some question marks about what's going on. This looks much more like a state-to-state kind of relationship, I think, in many ways between Russia and the Syrian regime, Russia and the Libyan regime, but we still have Wagner adjacent pieces in this context. And then obviously in Ukraine, maybe where it's fallen a little bit silent, given what happened with Prigozhin's mutiny. I think it's still a irrelevant being, if you will, especially its personnel. And we've seen Wagner militants kind of reappear, if you will, on the front lines in Ukraine, maybe in just different security outfits. So I think those are all the different places it's been active, and it's still kind of doing what it's always done, despite its leader no longer being with us.
So there were reports after the coup in Niger that the coup leaders had requested Wagner presence there. Any status on that? Has Wagner deployed to Niger? If so, what are they doing?
That's a good question. I think it makes sense given kind of the geography question of where Wagner's operated, that it would be a place that it might transition to. From what I've seen, what I've been monitoring, I haven't seen Wagner personnel move into Niger for a bunch of different reasons. Some of it might be capacity related. I'll kind of jump to Central African Republic. A lot of what Wagner did kind of on the outside of Bangui has now been reconcentrated to population centers. And I think that suggests that there's a way, an effort to try to keep up what Wagner's done without growing its enterprise while the Kremlin figures out what to do with the organization. So I think trying to expand to other theaters or other countries, if you will, is a difficult prospect for Wagner Corps. But with that, I think there's other entities that might try to move into the space, if not the Russian government directly. And that's kind of where my head goes when I think about Niger, when I think about whether or not Wagner can actually jump into a new environment.
Colin, I think you have something to add.
Yeah, I just think there's a lag effect oftentimes when we look at Wagner's presence in some of these countries, right? And I do think right now Africa is where it's at and will continue to be where it's at for Wagner or similar private military companies. But, there's a lot more of a legacy there with Central African Republic and Mali. When you have these coups, it does take some time for, I think, one, to come to terms on an agreement, right? What will Wagner actually be doing in this country? What's the quid pro quo? They're going to provide X and receive Y. And that takes some time to figure out. Then you have to think about the machinery of logistics, right? Of tooth to tail, getting into country, setting up, getting on the ground there. And so I look at countries like Niger, Burkina Faso. These are countries that Wagner has been eyeing for some time, but it does take time before we'll actually see them on the ground operating. What are those kind of deals? What do they look like? What form do they take? And I think, when we go back to a lot of questions I got after Prigozhin's untimely death, what took Putin so long to whack him? Of course, if you believe Putin was behind it, which I certainly do. And I think a lot of it was about trying to figure out exactly how Wagner operated. I don't think he fully grasped that. And it's an intricate operation. It doesn't look the same. It's not a one size fit all. And so it's not just something, where you kind of cookie cutter come in, place it over the new African country and then kind of roll out from there. I think there's a lot to kind of negotiate. And you have to think about, who they're dealing with here. They're dealing with warlords and military juntas, in some case, not the most sophisticated folks in the world. Maybe they receive different types of training, but I think there's a lot left to be desired in terms of, the interlocutors at play here.
Rafi, what are your thoughts?
So I think one other element we have to consider is the importance of Ukraine in all of this. I mean, Wagner and the Russian military and the Kremlin overall aren't able to conduct new operations because of how invested they are in Ukraine right now. Whether that will change in the future is a something that's up for speculation. But for the moment, that significant investment is going to affect their ability to expand, whether it's in Burkina or Niger or elsewhere in Africa or the Middle East.
Chris, let's wrap this up with you. Any concluding thoughts on this first question?
I'll basically just say I think what Rafa just shared is quite important in terms of thinking about the role Ukraine plays and Wagner's ability to kind of expand. And then I want to just tag along on something Colin brought up about who Wagner is working with, especially across African deployments. Whether or not they can expand in Niger and Burkina Faso, I think the other dimension there is whether these states want Wagner. Specifically, given the question marks around it, and whether or not they can see opportunities with the Russian state directly. And I think that's a looming question, one that I don't even think the Russian government has figured out yet.
So staying in Africa, Colin, there have been persistent reports that Russian Deputy Defense Minister Yunus Bekyevkurov recently led a Russian delegation to several African countries to reassure them that Russia would continue to operate there after Prigozhin's death. What are some of the key takeaways from this trip?
Yeah, I think, the Russians are keen to emphasize continuity here, right? They don't want to, even give a hint that there's some kind of break that could potentially open the door to another element here. Although I think, the Russians, I don't like giving the Russians credit for much, if anything, but they have invested a lot of time and resources in these relationships. And it's really fascinating to me because, I spent 10 years at the RAND Corporation. And a lot of my research there focused on security cooperation and building partner capacity. Now, we may not like what we're seeing, but this is actually some version of that. It's not certainly not the way that the U.S. would do it. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the Russians don't have anything close to Leahy vetting. In fact, they're known for quite the opposite, right? And in some ways, I think that's what's attractive is that, for some of these regimes that have seized power by force, no one's checking them on human rights. No one's lecturing them, right? They're not being limited in any way. Again, that's part of, that's part of the package, is that they're going to send guys there. They're going to come in. They're going to conduct some kind of scorched earth counterinsurgency operations. They're going to, do it with brutal force. And they're going to coup-proof these regimes that came to power through coups and kind of provide security. Now, that security often doesn't extend outside of the capital city, and these regimes are more than happy to give Wagner their cut. Some percentage of the proceeds to a lot of the natural resources, the minerals that Wagner's in these countries, to acquire and to obtain. And I think, this becomes, Rafi mentioned Ukraine just earlier and the importance of Ukraine. I think, we can look at what's happening in Africa, but Rafi's absolutely right. We have to consider the importance of Ukraine. And I think the second and third order effects of that, right? So as sanctions continue, the Kremlin's really looking for a way to keep revenue streaming in. And that's why I think, these kind of relationships in Africa become even more important for the Russian government, for the Russian state. They planted their flag there. They spent a lot of time not only on the kinetic parts, but also on the disinformation aspect. If you look at kind of, and I'm talking beyond just the handful of pictures we've all seen of a couple of guys on motorcycles with Russian flags, which I think have probably been used on maybe like 40% of any piece I've written on Wagner. I'm getting sick of the photo, the stock AP photo, right? But actually, when you look at opinion polls and some of the, they've got their faults, but if you look at the global south, if you look at parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it looks almost like the inverse of what we would see in Europe or North America in terms of how do you feel about the war in Ukraine, right? And the Russians have played this quite skillfully. I often think that we overestimate Russia's ability. For a long time, we thought that Putin was 10 feet tall. Everything he did was a masterstroke of genius, and, he's playing 7-dimensional chess. But, the invasion of Ukraine and Russia's kind of folly over the last year and a half, almost 2 years, shows that he's not invincible. He's not infallible. He makes mistakes like any other leader. However, I think, that it just goes to show you that investment in time, resources, relationship building, even with some unsavory characters, has paid off for the Russians, particularly in Africa.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Leahy vetting because, of course, one of the pretty persistent critiques of U.S. military assistance is it comes with, quote, too many strings, unquote. Leahy vetting, of course, is a process that requires all U.S. embassies to confirm that recipients of U.S. assistance in their country haven't taken part in gross violations of human rights. And of course, as you said, not only does Russia not do that, in some cases, it's quite the opposite, right? I mean, human rights violations are part and parcel of what Wagner does, and they're happy to partner with regimes that do the same. I guess they extract their strings in terms of concessions, like you said, often monetary or mineral concessions or oil and gas in Africa. So yeah, it's just an interesting discussion. And I guess Wagner also is seen as a little more agile and able to be there more quickly than we are, right?
No question.
There's been this pretty persistent pattern of Wagner chasing out Western or UN counterterrorism or peacekeeping missions in Africa.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's an interesting point that you raise, and it's something I hear a lot. Rafi, let me switch to you. So there are reports now that Wagner is being split up between two other Russian private military and security contractors with leaders linked to the Kremlin. The first is Redout, led by Konstantin Mirzayants, and the second is Convoy, led by Konstantin Pikalov. What does this mean in practice for how Russia uses groups like this?
I think it's a very good question. Basically, this is a kind of new approach to the same kind of Wagner private military company sort of operation that Russia, had conducted for the last several years. However, this approach is a little different in that it's kind of separating. It's this divide and conquer kind of idea that Colin and Chris were talking about earlier. It's making sure that there isn't one individual who has all of this power and is able to kind of influence both the political and military spheres. within Russia, as Prigozhin was able to do, to the point of near mutiny or mutiny, depending on how you want to define what happened in July and August. So now you have these two smaller groups. One of them, Red Tooth, is very closely connected to Spetsnaz. It has a lot of kind of those overlaps with the Ministry of Defense. So it can really be seen as a Ministry of Defense organization. Convoy, on the other hand, is a little bit more vague and a lot smaller. It's hard to see exactly how that organization could take on a large amount of Wagner's capabilities in Africa, because as of now, it's a very small operation that's, doing very specific tactical operations in Ukraine. So those are the two pieces. Whether they can take over all of Wagner's really large operations is really an open question. I would say that I think it would be very difficult for them, especially on the economic front, to be able to kind of build out or replace all of Yevgeny Prigozhin's economic and business contacts in Africa in the kind of way that he was able to conduct them pretty masterfully.
So we mentioned Africa. We've talked a lot about Africa. We also talked a little bit about Syria and Ukraine. Where else was Wagner especially active, or Russian PMSCs more generally especially active outside of those places? And what's the status in those places now?
I'll jump in briefly and just say, I think Chris mentioned earlier that in places like Syria and Libya, which is actually how I came to study Wagner. I'm a Middle East person by training and by background, and that's how they initially came across my radar. It's more akin to a state-to-state relationship in a kind of a classic, even though Libya is not a functioning state, there is an element there, kind of a warlord type individual. In Haftar, Syria, you're dealing with the Assad regime. And there's a lot of history, right? Because Syria is a classic Russian client state, buys a lot of Russian arms, receives Russian training. So I think the transition there was a lot easier than it was in some of these other places. But why I think these deployments are important is because of battlefield experience, of the experience of working with a range of other actors, not just state actors, but take a look at Syria. You've got all sorts of flavors of non-state actors on the ground there. Not only that, Wagner could be working with, think about, or operating alongside in parallel with the likes of a group like Lebanese Hezbollah, but who they're fighting against, and the experience fighting against a range of different actors in the Kurds, in ISIS. I know everybody's forgotten about the Islamic State, but I'd like to remind you that they are still out there. And this is just also, not to go down a rabbit hole, but when we hear about talk of destroying Hamas and destroying militant groups, I'd point to the Islamic State and say, the U.S. commandeered the global coalition to defeat Daesh with, I think, 84 different nations, bringing the full bear of the military weight to the table. And we still have not defeated the Islamic State. It's been significantly weakened, particularly in the Middle East, but its affiliates, branches, and franchise groups globally have grown, and in some cases grown stronger. So the experience that Wagner's gotten there, now they got tuned up quite a bit in Syria, mostly by the U.S. military in one of those engagements going back to, I think, 2018. But even that in and of itself is a learning lesson for a group that focuses on learning and agility. And we have a book that we're just starting to write, the three of us, and so that's going to be a key piece to what we're looking at is Wagner's ability to adapt, to learn, to innovate. So we'll be looking at different kind of vignettes along these lines to see how the group incorporated those lessons. We talk all the time about lessons learned and best practices. To what extent are they learning? I often think our British friends have it better because they call them lessons observed. They argue very rarely do we actually learn from them. And as we delve into the research here, we'll get a sense of just how successful Wagner's been able to be along those lines.
Chris, you have something to add?
Yeah, I think the one that, for whatever reason, slipped my mind is its immediate kind of refuge in Belarus. Sometimes I think we often forget about, just given it's a little opaque what they're actually doing there and whether or not they maintain a significant presence with their fighters. And so that's the one I just wanted to bring up is a place to echo what Colin talked about, experience in other locations that could pay dividends for the Russian state more generally and its fight in Ukraine, if not for its internal security. And so with Belarus, it's just one of those places where I think very clearly it became the default position of Prigozhin via the negotiation with Putin to park Wagner while the Kremlin tried to figure out next steps. And so I think that we at times forget about that as a particular location where it's operated, but it's still a really key piece of the Wagner puzzle that I think analysts are trying to solve.
Yeah, Belarus had fallen off my radar too. I had, almost completely forgotten that after the mutiny, that's where they were allegedly going to relocate to. And then, do we know what they're doing there? And we know how many of them are there. Are they just training? Or are they preparing to enter the war in Ukraine? A little bit of both?
I can speculate. I don't know that I can confirm. I've spoken with several folks who are, Belarusian analysts who suggest that there's an incentive from Belarusian government to ensure that internal security is beefed up. Training for Wagner personnel is ongoing to keep them ready, if you will. But a lot of this, from my understanding, was Lukashenko's effort to try to enhance his own security. But outside of that, it's I don't know what the flow of fighters looks like back and forth, if that's even happening. And, I can't imagine that many Wagner personnel see value in staying in Belarus absent a paycheck. And so how they're getting resourced in Belarus, there was a friction between Lukashenko and the Kremlin on who would actually fund the Wagner outfit in Belarus that is still, for me, a little opaque. And I think that some of these personnel might find value in jumping into one of these other outfits as opposed to staying in Belarus.
Sure. Rafi, let me throw this one out to you. Wagner provided the Kremlin a veneer of deniability since it wasn't formally part of the Russian government. This did mean sacrificing some control over its operations. After Prigozhin's mutiny, will the Kremlin be willing to allow Russian PMSCs the same type of independence Wagner had?
So I think the difficulty here is you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't have the deniability while also preventing the independence of groups. You basically have to choose one or the other. One strategy that the Kremlin could adopt is, as we've talked about, kind of breaking up this, Wagner kind of umbrella organization into several smaller groups that are nominally independent and nominally have some amount of plausible deniability. Again, the question becomes, if you're capable of plausible deniability, you're also capable of conducting operations that the Russian state doesn't want you to do necessarily, which is a lot of what was happening with Wagner over the past, year and a half plus. So it's a balancing act that I don't know if Russia knows how to figure out. And to be frank, I don't know if they want to figure it out. I think the kind of chaos strategy has been useful for them.
Colin, what are your thoughts here?
I think one of the lessons that the Kremlin's learned from this, right? And I had a piece in the New York Times where I think I'd initially titled it like Putin created a monster that he lost control of, essentially saying it was kind of a Frankenstein's monster. And so that's one of the lessons, right? Is not to let this actor grow too powerful, although with power comes combat effectiveness, right? And so there's that kind of temptation to keep building them up, but not to let them grow too autonomous. And I think that was another thing, is that Putin really lost control and Prigozhin kind of came into his own. Now, one of the things that we've talked about as a research team is, what are kind of over the horizon? What are some of the lessons learned that other countries that look at what happened might learn? We've kind of dabbled in, speculating about what China has learned from all of this. And I think the more China becomes comfortable using kind of private military companies, contractors, that's certainly one of those lessons, right? Is don't let these take on a life of their own, because you can very quickly lose control, right? And so keep them under your thumb. But again, that's Rafi just described this balancing act of you go from plausible to implausible deniability when we start looking at these command and control linkages going all the way back to the upper reaches of the government. So I don't think there's any perfect recipe for success here. I think at this moment, right, we're talking late November 2023. One of the benefits of what happened in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel is that people are paying less attention to what the Russians are doing. And I think Vladimir Putin really likes that. That's something that, has benefited Moscow quite a bit. And so I think there's this temptation to then kind of build them up. But again, right, it's almost a divide and conquer strategy. Don't let any of them grow too big for their own good, and kind of, keep them, at this middling stage between growing into this behemoth, but also, they need to bring again, combat effectiveness, train the trainer capabilities to the table too.
Is there an economies of scale argument to be made here too, that Wagner was big enough? It was big enough to be dangerous to the Russian government, as June obviously demonstrated, but it was also big enough that it could handle some of its own logistical support, right? In a way that a bunch of smaller PMSCs would not be able to. But it still leaned heavily on the Russian Ministry of Defense for logistical support, as we saw in Ukraine, right? That was one of the big arguments or points of contention between the Ministry of Defense and Wagner, was Wagner claiming it was not getting the support it needed. So will a series of smaller PMSCs, that if Wagner is replaced by a series of smaller PMSCs, will that complicate the logistical relationship between the Ministry of Defense and these companies?
That's a great question. I haven't thought a lot about it, but it gets the wheels spinning and thinking about how you might implement best practices if you're the Russian government. It runs into conflict with the point raised by Rafi about you can't have your cake and eat it too. The Russian government could very clearly continue to resource a series of smaller outfits and be the coordinating agent, if you will, for that logistical challenge that might be impossible for smaller PMSCs to solve, but at the same time that it loses the benefit of plausible deniability that these entities so often bring for the government. But I think it really depends on the theater that we're talking about as well, where the organizations are operating. And so what their mission set might be, whether it's just regime security and not offensive capabilities, I think that small outfits might be able to solve that logistical dilemma by just providing what's necessary for the government, the hiring agent. Whereas if we're talking about something like Mali, or maybe even moving into other theaters that they were previously involved in, like Libya and Syria, that's a really difficult logistical challenge just in terms of from a resourcing standpoint that I don't know is overcomable by a small outfit. So that's maybe a non-answer to your question, but a really interesting and important one to consider.
Chris, let me stay with you here since you flagged this issue. The issue of reports in the media about former Wagner fighters, predominantly convicts, being possibly recruited by the Russian National Guard, Rosgvardia. So what would that do for the Russian state if this is indeed true, that Wagner convicts are being recruited by Rosgvardia?
Yeah, it's one that I've thought about all the potential reasons why you're doing this. And the one that I kind of land on is it provides an outlet for former convicts to be employed. So you get a benefit here. You not only get to employ former convicts that were part of the Wagner outfit to maybe quell their engagement with your broader population in ways where they're creating havoc, if you will, struggling to be implemented back into society. You might actually be able to take forces from the National Guard to use in a more offensive way in Ukraine, though I don't know that we've seen a ton of evidence of that yet. I think that this is one of those ways where it's a resourcing and manpower augmentation that becomes beneficial for your regime. I think there's a bunch of problems that arise from that as well when you think about employing former convicts. But it's still one of those things that becomes, from my standpoint, it's better than just allowing them to kind of run around without any direction in terms of employment, prospects for a future, and that added benefit of human capital influx.
Colin, and then Rafi.
Yeah, so I had a piece in the Wall Street Journal about this some months ago, where I talked about the potential risk to Russian society if and when these folks start filtering back into everyday life, right? Because it's very unlikely that people that were career criminals, convicts, rapists, overall thugs, who then get deployed to some of the most hardcore fighting that we've seen for some time, experience who knows what, and then come back in, are going to become teachers and bakers and auto mechanics, right? They're likely going to be reabsorbed into existing Russian transnational criminal organizations and cause some significant problems for the Russians at home domestically. So I do think Chris is right in terms of kind of reabsorbing them into other existing PMCs makes a lot of sense, not only for the combat power, or cannon fodder really is what they've been used for in many ways, but to avoid those domestic issues of instability on the home front. I think a lot about this from a branding perspective too. And I think, we often thought of, or at least I thought of Wagner as a more kind of, elite expeditionary force before Ukraine, February 2022. Once you start dipping into jails and prisons and conscripting fighters and offering them HIV medication, to fight, it's pretty dystopian. It's also one of the reasons I really don't think we should be considering Russia in the conversation about so-called great powers. No great power has to go in and do this, right? I mean, this is a military that's scraping the bottom of the barrel here. And I think from a branding perspective, it does a lot of harm. It really sullies the brand, not only of Wagner, but of the Russian military, right? I mean, this is not quite Spetsnaz when we're getting, 50-year-old lifelong criminals to go to the front line. So what does that say about, cohesion? What does it say about morale? What does that say about your uniformed forces if you need these guys on the front lines to kind of be the tip of the spear? So I think it was clearly an act of desperation. They thought that they needed to do this. It also kind of shows the way that Russians view that the Kremlin views their own citizens. They're expendable, right? And that's not a message you really want to convey to future generations. So I think that move, there's a lot more implications there than meets the eye. And I think it's going to have some significant impact in Russia for years to come.
Thanks, Colin. Rafi, your thoughts?
So I would kind of piggyback off of Colin on this, and I would note that I think the reason that Russia's, relying on these irregular formations in Ukraine, whether it's prisoners or far-right extremists or what have you, is because there is a legitimate fear of what's going to happen if the reserve are called up. If there is a full mobilization, what does that mean for the Russian state? Will it cause, ethnic unrest in Chechnya or Dagestan or anywhere else? I think Russia has serious problems when it comes to manpower reserves that they're trying to paper over, that the Kremlin is trying to solve with all of these kind of expedient moves that may pay off in the short term, may be helpful, but they're really creating these kind of societal instability factors for the future.
Why should we care about Wagner or other Russian PMSCs? How do they affect U.S. interests?
Yeah, I think they make it difficult to compete first and foremost in some of the places where, to maybe bring up what Colin brought before, where jihadist threats and terrorism are on the rise, and where we've devoted maybe the better part of the last 2 decades to trying to quell the spread of terrorist groups and not violent non-state actors. And Russia's going in there via these private military and security firms and not necessarily rectifying the challenges that the governments are facing there. And we're struggling to compete. I think more generally, we should probably care a lot about it from a U.S. standpoint, because I think we'd be having a very different conversation had Russia not actually launched its invasion of Ukraine. I don't think Wagner would disappear like it has. We might see the kind of friction between these ad hoc non-state agencies like Faulkner and the Ministry of Defense, had there not been human capital challenges and logistical challenges the Russian military didn't plan for when it invaded Ukraine. And all that's to say is Wagner, I think, would still be alive and well in the way that it was beforehand, even in the face of our meaning the United States, kind of financial restrictions and penalties we tried to attack the organization with. So I think that's a really important problem set that we haven't perfectly solved. We benefited from the Russian chaos in Ukraine.
Rafi, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think Wagner is exacerbating a lot of the problems, especially in West and Central Africa, regarding terrorism and lack of state stability that are going to have dramatic long-term implications, both for the US and for the world. I mean, we're looking at a set of countries on a continent that is going to have massive, huge population expansion over the next 50 years. Are these new populations going to be coming up in a world just completely characterized by jihadism, lack of government sort of structure? Is that something that we, as the United States want to see kind of moving in the future? And unfortunately, what Wagner is doing in these countries is making that instability a lot worse. I think we're seeing in Mali the level of violence against civilians going up massively. The same thing in Central African Republic. Do we want kind of this trend to continue moving forward is the question we have to ask ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting that you characterize it, Wagner as sort of creating instability, especially in Africa. I just finished a book chapter on Chinese-Russian relations in Africa, and the way I characterized Russia in Africa as an agent of chaos, and primarily because of what the Wagner Group is doing. And I wondered, sort of in the conclusion to the chapter, if that would not be at some point a bone of contention between China and Russia, because China needs stability in Africa for all of its BRI investments and its economic investments to bear out and to pay fruit. So I guess not a topic for discussion today, but just something I think about. So Colin, bring us home. Why should we care about Wagner and other Russian PMSCs?
Well, I think they're just making our job a lot harder, right? I think they're making the United States strategy a lot more difficult and challenging. So I've been looking at the Sahel quite closely. After 9/11, I think we were really kind of searching for a grand strategy. And in lieu of one, we used the GWAT, the Global War on Terrorism, where counterterrorism became our guiding principle, it became our grand strategy. And I know this is a bit hackneyed and well-worn of a cliche, but when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We cared a lot about failed states and ungoverned regions. We've since moved on to great power competition, but those problems still exist. And so we still have to care about chaos in parts of Africa, including in the Sahel. And, the Russians are going in there. They're breaking a lot of things. They're extracting resources, and then they're going to leave, right? But they're not going to leave those, the problems aren't going to go away. And, who's going to be left to deal with them? The French are they've made it clear that they're not going to deal with it, right? So who's got the capability and the will to do it? It's going to be the United States. Now, how do we do that? We have literally no strategy to deal with the Sahel. I've spent a lot of time in DC over the past year, and I see some hand-wringing, some finger-pointing at pretty high levels, but I don't see a strategy. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration's strategy for Africa, I don't even think the word Wagner appears once. Private military companies is mentioned one time, and so we know who that is, right? And I think it was back in March, I was down at an event with the intelligence community, and somebody said, the real problem is going to be if these jihadist groups start creeping towards coastal West Africa. Well, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend that said they're doing exactly that. I had a piece in Lawfare back in May with Jacob Zen where we talked about this. So, who's minding the shop? What happens if these groups now start knocking over more governments, right? And when they do that, who does it benefit? Wagner. So it's this kind of, to use a DOD, I think this is a technical DOD term, self-licking ice cream cone. This is something that the Russians go in, they break a lot of things, they get what they need, and then who's left holding the bag? It's the United States. So I'd feel a little bit better if somebody at least said, hey, check, we're tracking it, and here's what we plan to do about it. But we're very reactive at the moment, and no doubt we've got a full plate and then some. We're dealing with the rise of China, which I think is truly the pacing threat. I don't think we should lose track of that. I think that's the long-term threat, but we've been very myopic. We've been very short-sighted and reactionary. And I wish, we have, and I think we do have some folks in government that maybe have the bandwidth to take a breath, step back and say, what do things look like in 3 years? What do things look like in 5 years? And how do we kind of set our strategy accordingly?
So Colin, Rafi, Chris, this has for me been fascinating and thought-provoking discussion. I'm really looking forward to your book coming out. So please do let us know when it's finished and ready to be published. Otherwise, thanks so much for the great discussion. And thank you all for joining me on Chain Reaction today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Chain Reaction, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping Europe and Eurasia. Throughout the year, we're talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, the past, present, and future of the Baltic states, Russia's political economy, and great power competition in the region. Note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of FPRI. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hamilton, head of Eurasia Research at FPRI. Visit us at fpri.org for more on today's topic and many others in the world of foreign policy and national security. Thanks for listening. See you soon.